When settlers first arrived in America, many saw the natives as resourceful, a trustworthy group of people who could be traded with. They respected their customs, their traditions, their values, and their way of life. However, others held the opinion that the natives were barbaric and uncivilized. To them, they were simply competition for resources and land. Some held the belief that Native Americans could be assimilated into society. Various churches and religious organizations would send missionaries to live among the natives. This was an attempt to convert them to Christianity, as well as to teach them English, American culture, and the American way of life. By 1830, however, the Democratic Party had committed itself to the development of the West and economic progress. Many members of the party saw the Native Americans as impediments to progress, and in order for the nation to thrive, they needed to be dealt with. Around this time, many tribes held land due to existing legal treaties between the government and the Native Americans. This frustrated white pioneers, as they were sick of the lack of opportunity in settled areas and wanted to push for the purchase of land to use and farm on, particularly Native American land. As a result, some people began to resent the Native Americans, almost going so far as to hate them. It is worth noting that prior to the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee Nation held land in the northeast of Georgia. This land was recognized by the Treaty of 1791. As time went on, the population of Georgia increased, and farmland became scarcer and more in demand. Eventually, gold was discovered on the land held by the Cherokee Nation. This led to jealousy and resentment amongst many of the settlers living in Georgia. They desired to take this land, and as a result, in 1828, Georgia passed legislation claiming the Cherokee Nation and their land.
1. The Indian Removal Act, which was passed on May 28, 1830, is composed of 8 sections. The first section makes it lawful for the President to divide land west of the Mississippi into different portions for Indian tribes to move there, if they choose to do so. The second section allows the exchange of lands between the United States and the Indians inside the United States. This makes it lawful for America to allow the Indians to move out of the United States into these newly divided regions. Section 3 makes the exchange permanent, saying the United States will forever guarantee to them and their heirs or successors the country so exchanged with them. But in this same section, it also says that if the Indians abandon the land or become extinct on that portion of land, that it will go to the United States. Section 4 says that the Indians will be compensated for the improvements made on their homestead. The fifth section allows for the President to give the Indians aid as they emigrate from their lands, and continue this aid for 1 year after they have left. The sixth section says that not only will the President give them aid in moving, but he will also protect them from any other person. The seventh section outlines that the United States will continue the same superintendence over the Indians as they did when they were within the country, as long as nothing in the act has violated a treaty held between the two parties. Lastly, Section 8 allows $500,000 to be spent from the Treasury to be paid out to gain these sections of land west of the Mississippi.
The Indian Removal Act was intended to remove the Indians from east of the Mississippi to the modern-day state of Oklahoma. The act passed by only 1 vote due to opposition from missionary groups lobbying against it. Jackson did not intend for the act to result in the deaths of millions of Indians, only to move them west. However, this was the result. The effects of the act lasted generations. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek Native Americans were taken from their homes and forced to walk on a treacherous and fatal journey west. If they survived the Trail of Tears, the natives had to assimilate to a different area than they were used to. In the east, these tribes mostly farmed and settled into communities, while the environment in Oklahoma encouraged a more nomadic lifestyle, which they weren't used to. This also caused many Native Americans to die due to starvation or other environmental factors. These effects lasted generations and still impact Native Americans today.
The constitutionality of Jackson's actions. In the mid-1800s, Georgia and the Cherokee nations passed laws that prohibited non-Indians from living on Indian land. You could only live on the lands with special permission from the government. In Worcester v. Georgia, Sam Worcester argued that his forced removal was unconstitutional because Georgia law did not apply to Indian territory. John Marshall wrote the majority opinion on this case and decided that the Constitution only gave Congress the power to make laws that applied to Indian nations, since the Constitution acknowledges Indian tribes as separate political entities. However, as Jackson reportedly said, John Marshall has now made his decision. Now let him enforce it. In doing so, Jackson refused to enforce this decision, and Southern states ignored what it said. Jackson has a history of disregarding the decisions of the Supreme Court. In the 1819 case McCullough v. Maryland, it was ruled that the Bank of the U.S. was constitutional. However, Jackson challenged the court's rulings and believed that he has as much power in declaring something constitutional as the courts do. In addition, there are many treaties with Indians that either guaranteed them compensation for the land they were abandoning due to their removal due to the Indian Removal Act, or allowed them to remain on their land. But since Jackson refused to acknowledge them as sovereign nations, he acted as though the treaties themselves were void, which violated the Constitution. But since he did not believe the treaties were valid, he was technically not breaking them. In a message to the Congress of the United States on December 8, 1829, Jackson declared of the removal, "This emigration should be voluntary, for it would be cruel as unjust to compel the aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land." However, in 1830, after the Indian Removal Act had already been passed, Jackson very quickly changed his point of view. He said, "If now they shall refuse to accept the liberal terms offered, they only must be liable for whatever evils and difficulties may arise. I feel conscious of having done my duty to my red children, and if any failure of my good intentions arises, it will be attributable to their want of duty to themselves, not to me." Although Jackson originally claimed that no tribe would be forced to relocate if they did not want to, oftentimes natives were forced by force, bribery, or corrupt tribal officials, or even threatening Indian leaders, and many natives who wished to stay in the states that they lived in were subjected to harassment as the government turned a blind eye. Although some historians believe Jackson struggled to prevent fraud and corruption in the natives' land, many others assert that he pushed the bill through Congress with the intention to forcibly remove Indians, and any promises he made that secured their protection were only to gain the necessary votes. Georgia officials claimed that Jackson himself in 1829 told a congressman that was disturbed by the delays in the Cherokee removal, "Build a fire under them. When it gets hot enough, they'll move." By 1835, some Cherokees had still not left their lands, and tensions were rising within their people. So Major Ridge, a Cherokee leader, who only spoke for a small fraction of the Cherokees, believed he could unify and protect his people by signing the Treaty of New Dakota, which ceded Cherokee land to the U.S. government in exchange for $5 million. Although the treaty passed through Congress, the Cherokees eventually rejected the treaty and assassinated Major Ridge and his son because he did not speak for the true intentions of the Cherokee people. But the damage had already been done, and the true Trail of Tears officially began. One member of the 7,000 federal troops sent to arrest and forcibly remove Indians would write, "I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle and sheep in 645 wagons, and they started towards the west." Jackson allowed this to proceed despite the fact that the Cherokees rejected the treaty, and despite the fact that there were numerous other treaties which had been signed which were supposed to protect the Cherokees' best interests in their land and allow them to remain if they wished. The 1830 Indian Removal Act itself did not allow them to be forcibly removed from their land. However, Jackson took the law into his own hands and did what he thought was best for the country.